would like to welcome you to all of you to what I would call this intellectual joint venture to explore the Confucian style of moral reasoning. I personally have been really looking forward with anticipation to this course. I remember quite vividly that virtually upon my arrival in Cambridge in 1981, after I had taught courses on Chinese intellectual history and philosophies of China at University of California, Berkeley for 10 years, the Dean of Faculty then, Professor Henry Rosovsky, approached me to consider the possibility of offering a course on Confucian ethics for the core. I was immensely interested, but my colleagues in East Asian studies persuaded me instead to offer the course on the tradition and transformation of China, commonly referred to as the rice paddies course. Although I fully enjoy that course, I taught that for quite a few years, I felt more and more attracted to the idea of addressing a scholarly subject which is not only intellectually stimulating, challenging, but existentially meaningful and, to me, emotionally gratifying. The opportunity actually presented itself in late 80s, but my initial proposal for the course was turned down by the committee in charge of evaluating courses in moral reasoning. It was a disappointment, but also a very good learning experience for me. Actually, upon reflection, I'm very grateful that my original proposal was rejected. My very extensive consultation with colleagues, both knowledgeable of and interested in the subject, helped me immensely to clarify my own mind, the concerns to be raised, and the appropriate ways of responding to these concerns. However, it took me another 3 years, let's say from freshman to junior, to work this out, to work the proposal out. But in the initial stage of my teaching this course, I was conscious and self-conscious of the perception that it was still inevitably a foreign culture subject. However, increasingly, I've been struck by the compelling relevance of the issues we must address to our immediate moral environment. The conflict between liberty and equality, for example, the tension between rights and responsibility. While we celebrate cultural diversity, we are very nervous about cultural relativism. Diversity on the one hand and the need for core values on the other. The demand of globalization and, of course, the need to search for our own cultural roots. Underlying all these issues are fundamental questions of self-knowledge and human self-understanding. That's why in the orientation, I stated some of the questions that have been bothering me and hopefully will be meaningful or significant to you. Are we isolated individuals? Or do we each live as a center of interpersonal relationships? What is the status of a very cherished value in our civilization? Individualism. Is moral self-knowledge necessary for personal growth? Or personal growth in some way is more defined in scientific, aesthetic, and other kind of achievements, not at all related or only marginally related to our inner sense of human worth, defined in moral terms. Can any society prosper or endure without developing a basic sense of duty and responsibility among its members? Some people say no. The more basic idea will be a sense of rights, a sense of private interest, a sense of direction based upon our own calculation as rational human beings. Should our pluralistic society deliberately cultivate shared values and a common ground for human understanding, whether the conflict, the marketplace of ideas itself, is what we should cherish? As we become acutely aware of our Earth's vulnerability and increasingly wary of our own fate as an endangered species, what are the critical ethical issues we must ask? In fact, this became very clear and became an important concern only in the 1960s. For the first time, the astronaut was able to look at the world and help us to look at the world from the total distance. Therefore, we realized the vulnerability of our lifeboat. Now, obviously, the course will focus on a number of assumptions which could be considered the Confucian bias, the Confucian preference, if you read it charitably, or the Confucian bias. What are some of these very basic biases or preferences of the Confucian approach? The perception of the self, of the person, as a center of relationships rather than an isolated individual. We're not islands, but we are rivers, and the rivers flow and will interact with other rivers. Even though sometimes we wanted to be left alone, like subterranean rivers, eventually will have to come out and interact with other human beings. Of course, there's also the conviction, which is very difficult to defend, sometimes misunderstood as an extremely conservative, even reactionary idea, that society ought to function as a community of trust. But community of trust based upon whose vision? The vision of the government, of the political elite, or the general populace? Who has the right to argue that the society is a community of trust rather than an adversarial systems? Many forces will have to come together to make a new kind of negotiation. Our main concern, of course, is to understand Confucian ethics, some of the basic motifs or orientations, its moral ideals, its core values, its sense of the good life, or the project for human flourishing, which is very much of a Greek idea of personal development as a form of human flourishing. But we'll also explore issues that could be considered as major liberal democratic critiques of the Confucian tradition. Authoritarian, too much emphasis on status, hierarchy, and of course, male orientation. And these issues arise in imagined and even actual, quote, Confucian societies, which of course refer to the area we now call East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. These are the industrial East Asian societies, very much under the influence of the Confucian tradition, but also socialist societies, such as the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and of course, the emerging importance of Vietnam. And of course, then we will be able to discuss Confucian views on nature, gender, and human rights. The strategy is to first try to sympathetically understand what this particular style of moral reasoning is all about. The more we can probe deeply into the inner resources, the more we'll be equipped with an understanding of its inner logic. But at the same time, because we have our own value orientations, our own ideas, they are very much, in some sense, incompatible with some of the basic Confucian orientations. We have to be critical and try to understand the limitations, the possible dangers, the areas that are totally incommensurable with our ideas and cannot be applied to our own situation. Now, the organization of this course is relatively simple. It's very conventional. 2 lectures, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 12, and 1 section per week. And you're urged to take part in all of them. The coursework, of course, will include your familiarity with the lectures and your participation in the sections. I would say you have to miss lectures, fine, but don't miss sections because you'll be noticed. All right. There are required readings. We ask for 3 short papers. We give you very clear suggestions or guidelines on how these papers will be worked out, how these papers should be composed. And of course, we don't have a midterm exam, we have a final examination. And for the final examination, there'll be there'll be essay questions, but potential examination questions will be given out in advance before the reading period. And there will be only one question, which is general question that you've not seen. All the other questions will be in the list of proposed examination questions. So you have sufficient time to think, reflect, prepare, and memorize your answers. We also have a kind of statistic way of grading. And with the size of the class, you have to recognize the differentiation, different conceptions, and things of that nature. In the course of the development, I will give you an account of how we're going to do it, how to make the grading practice not totally unified, but at least commensurable with the general standards. For a number of years, I took it for granted it's possible to organize course according to 3 separate, if not totally independent, separate approaches. So the total experience requires your exposure to some of the lectures, and the lectures sometimes turn out to be highly idiosyncratic. In other words, my views on some of these issues. This is one. Then there are required readings. You'll be exposed to some primary sources and also interpretive literature. So you form your own ideas about these issues, not based upon my lectures, but based upon your readings. Then, of course, you can do your own work and prepare for the exams, prepare for your own papers, and you will learn a great deal about that. And I don't care, at the time, I didn't care whether you come to the lectures or you can miss a lot of sections, but if the total experience turned out to be good, you'll be able to do well with the exam, do well with the papers, fine. But over the years, I find that's an easy way out for us, people who are involved in teaching. 3 separate ways you'll be obligated to do the kind of work you do. You do the integration and so forth. This time, I'm using a rather different approach. I'm going to explain very briefly. The different approach is to try to link my talks, which will be immensely difficult for me, and eventually you may find there are major problems, to link my lectures to the readings. So I'm hopeful that my talks will illuminate your reading, or at least to present some arguments to help you to read the assigned or the required texts. So if you look at the required text, reading and paper assignments, and also look at the lecture schedule, you see for the first time, actually, for the first time in my teaching experience, this is an attempt to come up with an integration. We start with, this one doesn't count, it's just an introductory note. Next week, we have 2 lectures, and the following week until February 22nd. Now, in these 4 lectures, basically, you'll be reading until February 13 and 15. You'll be reading Houston Smith's Confucianism and my introductory essay on Confucianism and Ted DeBerry's East Asian Civilization. So the lectures up to the 15th will be linked to this particular kind of reading. So from then on, by the 19th, you finish reading the Analects. The 2 lectures, Humanity and Wisdom, will be related to the Analects. And then you continue to read Herbert Fingerat's Confucius, the Secular as Sacred. And the 2 following lectures on ritual and self in transformation will be relating directly to the finger rap book. But of course, I reserve the right to explore issues that are considered significant. And then we have Mencius on rightness, learning of the heart, Xunzi, authority, self-cultivation, and the book on centrality and commonality, on sincerity and authenticity, embodying the universe, and then the spring break and so forth. Still, I hope that if you just follow the lectures, you get a more holistic, comprehensive view of some of the issues involved. And these are organized according to 3 stages. First, an attempt to familiarize ourselves with some of the core values. I call it the inner dimension or the basic logic of the Confucian mode of moral reasoning. Then we go through a process where we'll offer a number of critical reflections on Confucian ethics, normally from the liberal democratic point of view, but some other points of view as well, environmental, feminist, and so forth. Then we try to imagine whether there's a possibility of a creative response to some of these critical reflections. In fact, don't look at the Confucian tradition simply as a historical phenomenon. It's an evolving process. Therefore, many of the people who are involved in the tradition are still reflecting on some of those issues. The tradition, in a sense, is like a living tree or flowing river that is continuous. In fact, all major ethical religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or indigenous religious traditions, Hawaiian spirituality, Native American, all these traditions are evolving processes rather than static structures. So you have to be able to allow new possibilities, new creative synthesis, and critical responses to the various kinds of comments and remarks on the tradition. For each of the lectures, I'll try to prepare an outline just to guide myself so I would not just move into all kinds of other directions, but also to give you a sense of what are some of the issues that would be explored. I would stop for a moment and see whether any of you have any questions concerning the mechanism and the organization of the course, or some concerns you have that need to be addressed immediately. Yes? No. I think when they accepted my proposal, after the struggle for 3 or 4 years, I made an agreement that this course would be open. And I think one possibility, if for the seniors, of course, this is the last time, and you have to do it. Otherwise, you may not be able to graduate without a moral reasoning. Many of you wait until the very last moment to do that, and it's quite understandable. But for juniors, if this course is not offered next year, if you're interested in this also become a problem. So I think I haven't made up my mind yet. Next week, I'll make up my mind. I think this course may be offered again next year. So this relaxed attention for people, juniors or sophomores, you may be able to take it next week. Next year. And I would make the announcement next Tuesday once the decision is made. So that would, you may wait until the very last moment. Then you have to take something, right? Let me then address briefly the first topic. Maybe I pause for a few minutes for those people who have to leave and go to other classes. Actually, it's a very good ritual at Harvard. We have the shopping period. And when I was a graduate student, the shopping period was very long, 10 days. So we shop around for a very long time before we decide. And the administrators then decided to change it. So the shopping period now is extremely short. I think it's a loss. We should have a very long period of shopping. Don't have to decide what you want to do well into the second or third week. The introductory note to this course is learning to be human. Thank you very much. If you want to define the basic Confucian orientation, especially in terms of the ethical religious concern, you can actually characterize Confucian learning as learning to be human. This is very common in East Asia. 学做人, learning to become a human being. And this idea of learning to become a human being is focused on the idea of character building, not simply the acquisition of knowledge. A point of departure in the Confucian style of moral reasoning is the concrete living human being here and now. We have to think not in terms of abstract ideas in the past, in terms of general principles that are not linked to my lived experience here and now. The first question is, where do we begin if we want to take the whole question of learning to be human seriously? We begin with a reflection on things at hand, very close to our immediate concern. One specific feature, or you can say salient feature of the Confucian orientation is to take the world here and now, this world, very seriously. Not only as a point of departure, but as the way eventually we return. This is sharply contrasted with some of the great spiritual traditions in the world. Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth. In all the major religious traditions in the world, there's the assumption there's some spiritual sanctuary, a realm that is particularly meaningful to us, which is not necessarily directly linked to the world here and now. We need to think of the kingdom of God, need to think of the Brahman, the ultimate salvation by leaving the home. But the Confucians very early on, embodied in Confucius himself, was to take the world that we're living here and now absolutely seriously as our point of departure. The assumption is the commitment to the world, far from being an adjustment, just simply adjustment to the status quo, is to take responsibility of both our body and mind in the complex human relatedness. It is not an attempt simply to sacrifice my personal dignity, my personal aspirations and gratifications for the sake of the well-being of the good of the society at large. That is a misreading of the Confucian message. It is not submission to the status quo. The assumption is that learning is always learning for the sake of the self. So learning is character building. For the sake of the self, but the self is never an isolated individual. It is in this sense that's the commitment to the idea of self-transformation. An underlying assumption is that there is faith, which I think is very common in most religious traditions, faith in the transformability of our own human condition or improvability of our own human condition through our own self-effort, our own effort, not as an isolated individual, but as a community of like-minded people. So self-cultivation in this sense is a communal act. Communal act in the sense it's not just the quest for one's own inner spirituality, but for something that flows beyond one's own private interest. If in a very initial stage you try to conceptualize the Confucian project, the resources that you can draw, not just from books, but also from your own immediate experience, and see whether that kind of argument is at all compatible with your concrete experience. There are 4 dimensions that need to be noted in your conceptualization of the Confucian style of moral reasoning. One is the question of the self, our own self. The second is the question of community. The community has to be understood in the degree of sophistication. In other words, community is not just the nation. The community is also the society. It's also our family. It's also our university. It's also our dormitory. It's also our small working group. It's also the group of people we all interact in the laboratory. The community is a much more complicated idea of a series of concentric circles. So the one dimension is the self, myself. The other one is the community understood in a very sophisticated way. And the third one is nature. And the fourth one is heaven. Don't ask me questions about heaven in the first 3 or 4 lectures. Maybe not even the 5th or 6th. Try to figure it out. It's not God, it's not Brahman, it's not Buddha, it's something. Just imagine it as transcendent referent. There's also heaven. Don't reduce heaven simply to nature. Nature, many scholars in China, under the influence of Marxism, therefore anti-religion, consider the Confucian idea of Tian, which means heaven, is not different from natural order. But I want to preserve heaven as a category which cannot be reduced to nature. In a very simple-minded, even formulaic ways, you can say the self is always essential relationships. The community ideally is a community of trust. Nature is our home, and heaven is the ultimate source of the meaning of life. And yet, one paradox, we'll work this out eventually, one paradox is that ultimate meaning of life is not only realizable, but must be realized in ordinary human existence. Anything I do as a person, as a student, as a teacher, as a husband, as a wife, as a daughter, son, or mother, father, is meaningful not in a very limited private sense. It's meaningful politically, socially, even cosmologically. We can work this out. In other words, the paradox is the ultimate meaning of life is realizable and must be realized in ordinary human existence. To say the self is essential relationships is to suggest the idea of the self is always in transformation. Ceaseless process of transformation. So we should imagine ourselves as a stream that flows rather than as a static structure. We should very early on in our life develop some sense of direction. But if the direction becomes too narrowly defined in terms of specific goal that could be calculated in terms of certain kind of profit, you'll be in trouble. Because the unpredictability of human life should also be understood as part of our ordinary experience. Therefore, the self is not only essential relationships, it's the dynamic process of transformation, and that process encounters always new possibilities, new experiences, new kinds of dangers. So you can imagine a person as a ceaseless in the ceaseless process of transformation. It is in this sense, it's important for us to cultivate the kind of relationships that will enrich our experience. This is not simply pragmatic. It's not pragmatic, not even altruism. It is the way we live. When we think about ourselves, it's almost impossible, at least in my experience, maybe many of you can do that, impossible to imagine myself totally independent of the relationships. But it's not, the sociologists try to impress us, these are the roles that we assume. Now you all assume the roles of students, I assume the role of a teacher, and then afterwards, if you become a tutor, you assume the role of a teacher, you assume the role of an assistant in the laboratory, you assume the role of a big brother, and so forth. it is intrinsically unnatural from the Confucian point of view that we assume these roles in a dramatic sense, because we are students, we are teachers, we are doing the things that inform our own self-understanding and our public perceptions. We are not playing roles. We're developing ourselves. It is in this sense one thing that's difficult. I was debating whether I should get it in the first talk or not. It's a bit technical, but it's important. It's to say, how can you imagine a situation where the various kinds of forces that shape me as a particular person are not constraints alone. They can also be transformed into instruments or vehicles for self-realization. I think this is probably a very important Confucian insight, but it needs to be worked out. The assumption is this: each and every human being is a concrete living being situated in a particular time, space, and all kinds of other social forces. I single out a number of them familiar to us: ethnicity, gender, language, land, class, religion. Each person is a member of ethnic group, even though gender now has been broadened, not just 2, maybe 4 or 5 different kinds of genders, but still a particular gender. Actually, the United Nations itself, I attended the social summit in Copenhagen and in preparation for the Women's Conference in Beijing. And in the official United Nations documentation, based upon the challenge from Norwegian, Sweden, and especially Holland, they're much more liberated, much more open to all kinds of possibilities. Now, the official document is there are at least 4 or 5 different sexes. But then language, each one of us is in the linguistic universe. Many of us are in fact bilingual in 2 linguistic universes. Some people are even multilingual. If you came from Malaysia, you probably not only know Malay, you know French, you know English, you know some Chinese dialects, you may even know Tamil. And so many linguistic. But if you're monolingual, you're an American, and basically you're in an English-speaking community. But you are attached, even though now we imagine that we can travel all over the world, but still we are tied to a particular territoriality. That's our land, the place. Now, in deference to the Marxist persuasion, each human being is linked to a particular social group and economic group. Some of the Marxists will say there's no human nature, there's only class nature. Our nature is determined by the social relationships, especially the economic relationships based upon a particular stage of the means of production. And also, whether we like it or not, either through socialization or early personal choice, we have an ethical religious orientation. Some people say habits of the heart. So ethnicity, gender, language, land, class, religion, these are constitutive, integral parts of our being here and now. So when we say a concrete human being, a concrete living human being, we have to take into consideration of all these aspects. I call them our primordial ties. It is in this sense very easy to argue that each person is absolutely unique. You just cannot find a duplicate anywhere else. We imagine that we can be cloned, so we will do all kinds of things, but that's in the future. Right now, a concrete human being is unique. In most ethical religious traditions, the message is to say, despite, notwithstanding all these limitations, we should be able to go beyond. One of the most radical solutions to this is the Buddhist solution. The Buddhist solution is to cut loose of all the primordial ties. True salvation of the person is to cut loose the primordial ties. So all these will no longer be an attachment or constraint. We're liberated. The Christian tradition too, or the fellowship, for example, The questions was asked, I have parents that I need to take care of them. I cannot follow you. Master, I cannot follow you. Well, let them take care of themselves. Follow me. To leave your primordial ties, leave your family and join the fellowship is to realize your spirituality, independent of your familial ties. The Hindus, the Indians, they criticize the Buddhist position, not because the Buddhists want to cut loose of these primordial ties. They say they managed to cut these ties too early. They don't encourage children to become monks because they haven't experienced anything yet. But they don't mind people like myself to become a monk because you leave the world in order to purify yourself. After you become a student, they call it apprentice, you become a householder, you work in the world. When you turn 50, it's the time for you to retire, and gradually you leave the world and allow these primordial ties to subside. Eventually, they will not have a major hold on your life. The Confucians, in this sense, are different. They believe that these primordial ties are so much a part of us, not only they need to be recognized as constraint, they also should be recognized as resources. Not only that, self-cultivation means our ability to transform these constraints into resources for self-realization. So the answer is that I can become what I ought to be, not by transcending my ethnicity, but realizing myself through my ethnicity. Not by transcending my gender, but working through my gender. Not transcending my language, but working through. And to be attached to the land of my birth is not necessarily a constraint. It is also a way of trying to free myself. So in this sense, to transform the constraints into instruments of self-realization becomes an important aspect of the Confucian quest for self-realization. We can imagine this in terms of two processes. It's both a broadening process and a deepening process. The broadening process is very easy to understand. That is, learning for the sake of the self as a central relationship is a ceaseless process. And one way of looking at this ceaseless process, endless process, is to imagine our life in terms of a series of concentric circles, from the person to the family, to neighborhood, to society, to nation, to the world, and beyond. What we have, again, you have to imagine this, but of course, many of us experience it on a daily basis now. Each community that is meaningful to our personal self-realization is both a condition, therefore a constraint, and also an instrument of self-realization. If we cannot go beyond our self-centeredness, we suffer from egoism, selfishness. We can only care for the things that are immediately relevant to us, not even our closest family members. But if we can only relate meaningfully to our family members, close kin, rather than anyone else, then the Confucian ethics becomes a kind of a mafia ethic. That is, internally, there's a great deal of sense of affection and concern, but very brutal, sometimes extremely insensitive to the area that is outside your family circle. If you do not go beyond your neighborhood, you suffer from parochialism. If you do not go beyond your ethnic group, you suffer from ethnocentrism. If you cannot go beyond your country, you suffer from nationalistic chauvinism. If you cannot go beyond your own gender group, you suffer from either exclusive male orientation or exclusive female orientation. If you cannot, this is something difficult to grasp, but I think eventually we should get into the question. If you cannot go beyond the human species, you believe that anything that is good for the human species is good for everything. Man is the measure of all things. Then you suffer from anthropocentrism. The anthropocentrism may turn out to be a human disease because the land can be polluted. The environment in which we live may eventually turn out to be unlivable. There are a series of paradoxes. You can actually graft both the Confucian strengths and limitations on these paradoxes. The Confucians put a great deal of emphasis on self-cultivation, but many Confucians suffer from egocentrism, self-centeredness. The Confucians put a great deal of emphasis on the importance of the family as a nutrient for self-realization, but the Confucians suffer from nepotism, from family connectedness. Sometimes they function like mafia members. The Confucians take their neighborhood, take the people that are directly relevant to them seriously to form the network, which may become very powerful, even in economic terms, but they suffer from parochialism. The Confucians also suffer from ethnocentrism, nationalism, anthropocentrism, and so forth. Now, let me end with another process, another statement, that is learning to be human is not a broadening process, it's also a deepening process. Deepening process in the sense we take our body absolutely seriously. You can even say Confucian learning is body learning. Or not necessarily you go to the health club and build up your muscles. But body in the sense, again, we'll get a chance to explore this a little bit further. Body is not something we own. I do not own my body. I actually am my body. I learn to become my body. Just one simple example. Kids learn to walk, to sit, to use utensils. All these learning turn out to be painfully difficult, requires repetition, requires a great deal of time, not to mention learning a language. All this learning is to allow the experience of learning to be inscribed in our body. So our body is being transformed as a proper expression of our emotions, of our rational way of dealing with the outside world. So the Confucians, they talk about learning archery, song, dance, calligraphy. All these are involved, all these are connected with disciplining the body. Sometimes we call it ritual, allow the body to follow a certain kind of ritual. But it is also heart and mind, both the cognitive idea in the sense of reasoning of the mind, but also the emotional aspect of the heart. The Chinese word xin, or the Japanese kokoro, is both heart and mind. It's difficult for the Confucians to argue that we can think without emotion, like a thinking machine. It's a calculation, thinking machine without emotion. They believe that anything we do, to think, to will, involves an affective dimension. It involves the emotions. And finally, learning is also, as a transformative act, is to purify our soul and to make our spirit brilliant. What is the Confucian idea of soul, or what is the Confucian idea of spirit? All these could be further explored. I share with you one of my favorite quotes from the Centrality and Commonality. Only those who are absolutely sincere, meaning those who fully realize themselves, can fully develop their nature. Their nature meaning their inner resources. If they can fully develop their nature, their inner resources as being human, then they can fully develop the nature of others, not just themselves, but nature of humanity. They become exemplars of humanity. If they can fully develop their nature, and the nature of others, they can then fully develop the nature of things, in the sense they will be able to understand not only the human community, but also nature. There's possibility of harmony between the human species and nature. If they can fully develop the nature of things, they can then assist in transforming and nourishing the process of heaven and earth. If they can assist in transforming and nourishing process of heaven and earth, they can form a trinity with heaven and earth. A very basic assumption in this connection is that a person, a human being, is not only a central relationships, but is a person who is a co-creator of the universe. As a co-creator, we are both beneficiary of the cosmic process, but are also responsible for its well-being. Implicit in that is the idea of the person, a human being, as a co-creator, can also become a major destroyer. Destroyer of ourselves, destroyer of our community, and destroyer of nature and of heaven. So human beings so conceived could be an extremely precarious being. And whether we'll be able to do well or do poorly depend upon not only our own personal will, but also the community in which we're a part. Thank you.